first of all, to express our appreciation to SPC and the Pacific Data Hub for the invitation for us to partner today together with NDI and IFES on this important webinar series, which revolve around very important governance issues. These partnerships and synergies are very important for knowledge sharing, for coordination and complementarity, but most of all for maximizing the impact of our work for the people in the Pacific. So thanks and congratulations, colleagues, on your focus and your ongoing efforts on data collection and promoting open data and open government. Is evidently data is very critical, as mentioned, for evidence-based decision-making, for transparency and accountability, for fight against corruption, and also for overall development planning. As we work to help countries in the Pacific, data is also important for our better tailoring of our work to the realities and needs of the Pacific. So real appreciation, and we really look forward to the results of your continued work, and also for us benefiting from the data that is being generated. So today I'm here with my colleague Sarah Power, and we will share some of our knowledge about the principles and values of the right to information gained through our anti-corruption work. With the main message from us being that right to information is very closely linked with the topic, of course, of open data and open government, because it is equally critical for keeping necessary vigil on the instruments of governance, for containing corruption, and for making democracy work for everyone. In the recent years, we have been working across the Pacific in 14 Pacific countries to foster knowledge and inspire action among different stakeholders around the importance of the right to information and open data for improved transparency, accountability, and better anti-corruption results. Our anti-corruption work and right to information work is generously funded by the government of New Zealand and the government of the United Kingdom, which we would like to express our gratitude on this occasion as well. So with that, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Sarah to present more details, and then we will be, of course, open for any questions. Thank you, and Vinaka. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks, Yoli and SPC for having us here today. I'm just going to get straight into it because we've got only a little bit of time. But here on this slide that you're seeing right now, this is just the current and former Secretary General of the United Nations, just reiterating the importance of right to information and government openness and transparency, just demonstrating its importance, echoing through senior management in the UN, and it's really a top priority at the moment for the UN. So I'll just pop to the next slide. So before we get into it, so our whole presentation is really about right to information and what that can do for transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption in the Pacific. But before we get into it, I thought we'd just get some terms out of the way. So what exactly is right to information? Well, there's a lot of different terms that different countries use to describe right to information. There's right to information, or RTI, freedom of information, FOI, or access to information, or the right to know. And these generally seem to mean the same thing, although there might be some differences between country and different jurisdictions. But it just refers to the right of all persons to access information held by public bodies. And it just reflects the principle that all information held by governments and other public institutions is public information, and therefore should only be withheld from the public for legitimate reasons that are within the public interest. There's also other terms that get used a lot in this space, such as open government and proactive disclosure. So all we mean when we say proactive disclosure is how the government gives information to the public without necessarily needing a request to have been made. So this could be as part of legislation or as part of your right to information legislation, or it could even be as part of a policy that exists outside of law, or it could even just be the practices that a government agency that goes about doing and how they go about it personally. That's not necessarily a countrywide policy. In terms of open government, often again, this can be defined in many different ways, but it may just refer to strategies or initiatives that are based on the principles of transparency, integrity, accountability, and stakeholder participation. So right to information might just be one method or one component of achieving an open government. So I'll just move on to the next slide now, and this is about where right to information comes from. So I won't go into it too much, but where it originated from was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both in Article 19, as it's considered a fundamental part of the freedom of expression. It comes up in a lot of components of other international agreements as well and policies, but these are the two articles that it really just started from. So in the next slide, I'll just go through some key right to information principles, just to give you a better idea of what right to information is and how it should be applied. But I do need to do a disclaimer that there is no one set international standard on right to information. Every country has a different Right to Information Act. Every country has a different opinion on what should be done. And this ranges from agency and different NGOs, and there isn't an internationally standard practice for it. But we do recommend following these principles. These are based on a few different UN articles, such as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, Article 10, and other sources like the Information Disclosure Policy Toolkit for Pacific Governments, which is a Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, as well as just general principles noted from different jurisdictions around the world. But again, no two countries are the same, and what works in one country might not work in another country. But the first principle that we talk about is the principle of maximum disclosure. So this principle just establishes a presumption that all information held by public bodies should be subject to disclosure, and that this presumption should only be overcome in limited circumstances. So what this means is that it shouldn't be on the person who is seeking information to have to justify why they need that information or why they're legally obliged to have that information. It should really be on the government agency who's been requested to explain why they can't give that information. And that can't be for any reason. It should be for a legislated exemption. The second principle is the right to access your own personal information. This is pretty self-explanatory, this one, but basically this includes being able to ascertain whether or not a particular body holds your information, what information is actually being held about you, whether that information was collected legally, and if that information was incorrect, you should be able to be given the opportunity to correct it. So this might not come under right to information laws necessarily. It could come under a Privacy Act, but it could come under right to information laws. And often countries do extend this into the private sector. So it's not just an obligation on public agencies. This is happening more and more now when agencies are tasking different corporations with collecting personal information on their behalf. So in this case, these rights do need to be extended in some circumstances into the private sector. The third is the obligation to publish information. So this is what I was getting at before with proactive disclosure. So this is just a principle that the government should really be releasing as much information as they can, whether requested to or not. But this also includes the idea that once an agency receives a request, they should then publish it. So this will diminish administrative burden because you don't need to continuously be responding to the same right to information request. But it also just means that the whole public, the whole community will have the opportunity to benefit from that, not just the one individual who's receiving that information. Principle 4 is the promotion of open government. So this is essentially to combat the tradition of non-disclosure and secrecy that does exist still in some countries. This is important because right to information relies on government employees to respond to requests. So they need to be in the right frame of mind to do this and have their right understanding of what their obligations are. So some things to promote open government could be education and awareness campaigns. And as we'll discuss soon, just some assurance to the person providing the information that they won't get into any trouble if that information leads to scrutiny or a media article or something like that. So principle 5 is a limited scope of exemptions. This links in with our first principle of maximum disclosure. So this is basically that any information that the agency deems should not be released should only be withheld if that information fits a clear and narrow set of exemptions that are subject to strict harm and public interest tests. So overly broad exemptions can undermine the right to information and should not be based on a desire to protect governments from embarrassment or the exposure of wrongdoing, because that's one of the principles of right to information. That's what we're trying to expose. But narrow exemptions could require governments to disclose information that may not be in the public interest, especially if those exemptions aren't based on a public interest test. So to balance both of these considerations, exemptions should be narrowly drawn, but only to the extent that they will capture all legitimate concerns regarding public interest. So the next one is processes to facilitate access. So right to information is often quite a process-driven activity. It often involves multiple timeframes, and sometimes a lot of stakeholders can be involved. So it's really key that requests for information are processed quickly and fairly, but also that there's really easy to understand and set established procedures for doing so. So the same goes for appeals. So it's key that a right of appeal is available to applicants who wish to have the decisions made by public bodies reviewed. This is because in the absence of independent review, individuals can't really be said to have a right to access information held by public bodies, but more just a right to have their requests for information considered. Ideally, this would be an independent, an impartial review body like an information commissioner or an ombudsman, but in some jurisdictions where this isn't possible, they can resort to a court, although these can be costly and expensive. Speaking of cost, principle 7 is it's not necessarily a principle because again, this really does depend on the country, but excessive fees have been shown to pose barriers to access and therefore undermine the right of access to information. So while this does not necessarily mean that public bodies should not have some means of recouping costs associated with providing access to information, this does really depend on the country and its context. So in principle, just as a general rule, government should ensure that fees for requests to information should not be so high as to constitute an unreasonable impediment to access to information. In some countries where fees are charged, these are only charged when the applicant requests a large amount of information, for example, and they might also have provisions that allow the waiving of fees for applicants who can't afford fees or where the applicant is requesting access to their own personal information or information that's very much within the public interest to be released. Principle 8, which we touched on before, is the protection for right to information administrators. So this is what I hinted at earlier, that promoting open government it's really important to protect those within the government who are tasked with releasing this information. To a reasonable extent, obviously they need to be releasing information in good faith as permitted by their right to information legislation. But this protection is really important in situations where releasing information may be disallowed by a secrecy law or where information release could be considered a breach of contract. So I'll just move on to slide 7 now. I know that was a lot of information in one go, but this next slide is about how right to information has been incorporated into the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So right to information and access to information in general sit within SDG 16, which aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable and inclusive institutions at all levels. We call SDG 16 an enabling goal because it's considered a cross-cutting goal, one that is required to be achieved for all the other goals to be achieved. For example, it would be impossible for governments to meet their climate change obligations if the government itself is not effective, accountable and inclusive. So we'll just go into the next slide where we've got another slide about SDG 16, but it's just explaining how access to information falls within SDG 16. So usually we put it under this category of 16.10 to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms. So this is again recognizing access to information itself as a key enabler of sustainable development for reasons discussed in the last slide, but essentially because without flow of information between the government and the public, governments can't be transparent or accountable to the public, which means they're less effective and less capable of achieving all of the other SDGs. So this slide 9, I'll just touch on the next slide just briefly, which is the 18th session on the Committee of Experts in Public Administration. So this one is just some questions that you can ask to test whether whether access to information and transparency initiatives have been effective, essentially. So I'll leave this for you to look at later yourselves, but in particular, it just demonstrates that when you're measuring the impact of initiative, you can't just look at the output, you need to look at the outcomes as well. So even where a country has enacted right to information legislation, this doesn't necessarily mean it's achieved access to information, because if requests for information are often denied or ignored, then the desired impacts, such as empowering citizens or contributing to debate or enhancing transparency, these can't exactly be achieved. So I'll move on to the next slide, which is about the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So in this slide, we include right to information included in Article 10, and it demonstrates how meeting right to information obligations can help to meet corruption obligations. So I guess here it's saying that adopting these procedures are important in the fight against corruption. It also provides some key areas where government should focus on in terms of what information it should prioritize the sharing of. So in this case, Article 10 is referring specifically to information on the organization, function, and decision-making processes of its public administration. So this is why in many Right to Information Acts, these will also include requirements for proactive disclosure by government agencies of lists of their functions and lists of their organization, because it's recognized that this information is of key importance to the public, both in terms of anti-corruption, but in many other ways. So the next slide here, this is what Julia was talking about earlier about the TNOR vision. So this document was developed at a regional conference that took place in Kiribati in February 2020, spearheaded by the president of Kiribati. I won't get into it too much, but it's just recognizing the importance of right to information for the Pacific. And this was later endorsed by the 18th Pacific Island Forum leaders as part of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat at their meeting in February 2021. The next slide, I'm just briefly going to go over some benefits of right to information. I'm sure I've mentioned a few during this presentation, but just to put them a bit more coherently. The first is improved democratic governance. So when governments become more accountable, where the public have regular and sustained access to information, this means that this can empower the public by giving them the power to ask questions about government policies, actions, and actually receive answers and share those answers with the public. And this can enable the public to make better and more informed voting decisions, which in turn creates better and more people-driven policies. The second is that it fosters public sector efficiency. So as we were saying before, the right to information requires the government to respond to requests. So this would typically lead to governments improving their records and information management systems, because they need to respond to these requests quickly and within a set time frame. So naturally, when government bodies are required to do this, any deficiencies in their records management will quickly be realised, because it will become quite burdensome to have to search through information and not have it readily available. Also, just the knowledge that a document might become publicly available will tend to improve the quality of documentation and policy advice. The third, quite similar to the first, is that it facilitates inclusive, rights-based and participatory development. So this is the idea that it will empower citizens to actively engage with their governments on policies and programs in the design and implementation or in the monitoring phase. And this can encourage a more inclusive approach to development. Fourth, as discussed earlier, it becomes a strong anti-corruption tool. As they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and open government means that there are less opportunities for corruption to go undetected. So a coherent right to information framework that will actually enable citizens, the media and civil society organisations to easily make requests can lead to the detection of corruption. The fifth is that it improves media reporting. So when journalists have access to source materials and aren't relying on hearsay and things that aren't published, this makes reporting more factual, but also enhances the investigative skills of journalists who are often unable to access this material. Six is that it opens opportunities for economic growth. So access to information leads to a more accountable and effective government, and this can lead to more foreign investment, as countries are more likely to invest in other countries with transparent and accountable governments. And finally, it can unleash innovation, because innovation is highly dependent on the exchange of information. So putting more information out there and allowing people to seek such information from the government can get ideas going and can increase innovation. And our final slide is just a quick overview of where we're up to in the Pacific. So a lot of countries have made moves on their right to information legislation. They've drafted bills and policies, and many of them are in the works, such as Papua New Guinea and the Federated States of Micronesia. But otherwise, the Cook Islands, Fiji, Palau, and Vanuatu all have right to information legislation. So thank you very much for that. Sorry, that was very quick, but yes, I'll be around for questions if you have any questions, and back over to you, Sioli.